Be
Today we are
recorded.
going to talk about figurative language. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Do, do, do. Boop. All right. So what is figurative language? Figurative language is a variety of literary tools that we can use to sort of dress up words and reading. Sorry, my dog is barking. It's a way to give words more power, meaning, or maybe what we would call color, just more interest. And it's also an opportunity for enhanced storytelling. So it just kind of makes things a little bit more interesting. So, for example, if I had the sentence, the ice cream was good, it gives me a little bit of information, but it doesn't give me that much detail. However, if I said, the first taste of ice cream felt as if I had jumped headfirst into a melty frozen lake where my taste buds were free to dance and sing. Not only does that give you a whole lot more information, but it's a lot more interesting. I can imagine that cold ice cream hitting my tongue, it's sort of cooling my whole body down, and the fact that it's very delicious. So all in all, as good writers or good authors, we want to look for examples of these things when we're reading because it helps to keep our interest. So there are many flavors of figurative language or literary devices, but today we're going to review 6 different kinds. The first kind that we're going to review are called similes. So when we're reading, how do we identify similes? I kind of like to think of looking for clue words like or as. So we're going to look for 2 different things that are being compared, always using the words like or as. So let's go through some examples. The baby was as light as a feather. Now, babies are alive and feathers aren't, but we're going to compare them with this word as in the middle so that we can imagine picking up a baby and it being so lightweight that it's as if we were just holding a feather in our hands. It gives us a good picture in our mind, so we know that that baby was really light versus being kind of a chunky baby. The next example would be the pillow was fluffy like cotton candy. So in this version, we are using like and not as. And even though cotton candy is something we eat and pillows are something we lay our head on, we can imagine that pillow being so soft and kind of luxurious and laying our head down on it. Again, it helps us to picture this situation. In the next example, it says, the snowflake sparkled like millions of diamonds. Again, 2 things that couldn't be more different. You know, snowflakes are sort of light and fluffy and melt in our hand, and diamonds are hard and they're a gem, a stone. But they both can sparkle in the sunlight, you know, and kind of reflect the light really well. So now we've got these 2 unrelated things, and we're comparing them to give us a better picture as we read it. And lastly, the sentence says, her singing voice was as sweet as sugar. Again, sugar is something we eat, a voice, you know, a songstress, someone singing a beautiful song. We know that the singing voice must be beautiful because we're saying sweet as sugar. Sugar is generally something that people like versus maybe something that's not so tasty. So again, let's always look for those clue words of like or as, and then we'll know that we have a simile. Some examples of similes in literature and pop culture can be found on this slide. So in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, there's this passage that says, he sat as still as a mouse in the futile hope that whoever it was might go away after a single attempt. But no, the knocking was repeated. The worst thing of all would be to delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, was probably expressionless. We've got 2 different versions of similes in this passage. The first one, which is bolded here, would be still as a mouse. I don't know if you've ever encountered a mouse, like maybe in your house or your apartment. I have, and typically when they see you, they stop and they freeze. So it gives you a good mental image of this character, again, maybe being afraid and having some fear. So they're stopping, they're being as still as a mouse. And then the second example, we have heart thumping like a drum. First one used as, the second one used like. Again, you know, hearts are organs in our body, drums are instruments. They really couldn't be 2 more different things. One's alive, one isn't. but we've all had that feeling before of being scared and our heart beating so loud and so hard that we are certain that someone else could hear it as loud as a drum. And another example would be from a wonderful song. It's been out for, oh my gosh, like 13 years or something now, but Hey Ya by Outkast. In it, they say, shake it like a Polaroid picture. And I don't know if you've ever used a Polaroid camera, but back in the day, people would usually shake the picture in order to get it to dry faster. And so in this song, the simile of shake it like a Polaroid picture is kind of encouraging people to shake their body, to move and dance as if you were shaking a photo from back in the day. Good example. So let's move into our second type of literary device, which is a metaphor. Now, it can be a little bit confusing because metaphors and similes are very similar, but the difference is, whereas similes we had our clue words to look for, like or as, metaphor does not have that. We're actually going to compare two things and essentially say the first thing is the second thing. We're going to use an object, an activity, or an idea to symbolize something else. So for example, looking at this first one here, the snow is a white blanket on the ground. If we had said the snow is like a white blanket on the ground, that would actually make it a simile. And that one little change of taking out the word like now makes it a metaphor. So we could certainly imagine looking outside and after, waking up in the morning, seeing a blizzard has come and now the whole ground is just covered in snow. And it might look similar to a white blanket. So we're using the white blanket as a symbol of the snow on the ground. The next example would be the assignment was a breeze. So we know that homework isn't like wind, but typically a breeze is something that's easy, light, and airy. So if someone says that the assignment was a breeze, we know that they're saying that it wasn't difficult, it was kind of easy to get through, no big deal. The next example, his anger was a pot boiling over. So I don't know if you've ever cooked something in the kitchen and sort of looked away while something was on the stove, maybe some pasta as it's sort of heating up, and all of a sudden you hear this like, you've got water boiling over, and it kind of has that effect of being very angry. It certainly doesn't look like a calm pot of water. So if someone's anger was a pot boiling over, you can imagine that they are getting ready to blow. They're so angry, they're kind of going over the top. So again, metaphors help us to really picture what we're reading on the page and give us that additional color. And lastly, we have an example of when their favorite show came on, the kids were glued to their seats. So hopefully the kids weren't actually glued to their seats, but again, we're using the kids' attention and how much they like this show as a symbol for, or them being glued to their seats as a symbol for how much they liked this show. So if they were enjoying it so much, they were going to be glued to their seats. They weren't going to move at all because they were having such a good time. So in real life, some examples that we can look for with metaphors, a book that I absolutely loved and also movie, the Roald Dahl story Matilda, there's this passage that I think is really powerful. So it says, the parents looked upon Matilda in particular as nothing more than a scab. A scab is something you have to put up with until the time comes when you can pick it off and flick it away. So are scabs typically something that we like? Not really. And it gives this impression, they could have just said the parents didn't really like Matilda that much. But describing the parents as looking at their child as a scab, it really gives this impression that not only did they think very little of her, but she was just sort of an annoyance, something that they couldn't, wait to get away from. And that's a pretty powerful message. And another song example that I kind of thought of was the song Titanium, where the singer sings the words, you shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am titanium. So a person isn't made of metal unless maybe they have a bionic limb or they happen to be like the Terminator or something. But titanium is a very lightweight but a very strong metal. So in this song, I think the person is saying, you can sort of come at me, you can try to defeat me. I might be small, but I am very strong. I'm like titanium, or I am titanium, which makes this a metaphor and not a simile. Let's move into our next example. This one is pretty fun, I think. It's called personification. And so what we will find when we are coming across this in some reading would be when human qualities or like actions or emotions, maybe even like thought processes, feelings, are being given to a non-human object or an animal. And it's actually pretty common. You see it quite a lot. But looking at some examples here. So if we said that piece of pizza looks good, we obviously know it's appealing. But if we sort of change the wording and say the last slice of pizza is calling my name, pizza can't actually call you on the phone. It can't shout out to you. That'd be kind of weird if it did. But when we use that phrasing instead, it's a little bit more powerful because it means like I can't get it off my mind. And it's giving this human quality of sort of shouting out to me or you by a pizza as a human quality. So it's personifying the pizza. And similarly, in the next example, the tired old car coughed and wheezed and crawled down the street is really great at sort of dramatizing this sentence. It gives us something good to picture because we could just say, you know, the old car barely made it down the block. But that might not put as much of a picture in our mind as imagining this car, you know, coughing, wheezing, crawling, you know, doing everything it can to barely make it to the stop sign, barely make it to the next house. It really puts a vivid picture in our mind. And the last example on the slide would be fire swallowed the entire forest. So swallowing is, you know, something animals and people do. Fire doesn't have the ability to actually swallow. But if we just said, you know, fire burned the forest, it might not put that powerful image in our mind as if we had said fire swallowed the entire forest. So we can really picture a fire like totally engulfed in flames. Much more of a better image that we get. So some examples in real life and pop culture are the first one that I had found is in a poem called Fog by Carl Sandburg. It's just a short little poem, but it says, "The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on." So, you know, fog isn't alive. It doesn't have feet. It doesn't have, it can't sit and it doesn't have legs. But when it's described in this way, you know, we picture that the fog isn't coming crashing in. You know, it comes in on little cat feet. Well, cats are generally kind of quiet and slinky and, you know, maybe slow. So we can really picture this fog, you know, rolling in very slowly, being very quiet. It just sits and looks over everything. It says on silent haunches, again, sort of giving us this image that the fog is creating this quiet and maybe almost eerie scenery, and then it moves on. So it's giving these human and animal characteristics to this non-human object to help us better imagine the scene. And essentially, most animated Disney movie out there, you can find some example of personification. It gets a little bit tricky because in some instances, you know, for example, this image is from Beauty and the Beast, and I think we're supposed to imagine in this universe that some of the non-human objects are actually sort of alive. But actually, in this picture, we'll use the example of like the napkins. The napkins kind of look like dresses, and they're dancing and whirling. We know napkins can't dress and dance, but it kind of adds to the excitement of the scene. Or these, like I think beer steins are sort of opening and closing their mouths to indicate that they're singing. Again, just giving these human-like qualities to non-human objects to add a little bit of fun. So our next literary device, an example of figurative language, is hyperbole. How will we know that we find it when we're reading? Well, basically we'll find exaggerated statements that typically aren't meant to be taken literally. You know, they're pretty over the top kinds of things. So for example, if we said your suitcase weighs a ton is 2,000 pounds. So the chances of someone's suitcase weighing that much probably are pretty slim. But when we say that, when we use this hyperbole, we can imagine, you know, is the person's suitcase light then? Is that what we're saying? No, we're saying it's supremely heavy. It's super duper heavy. And so we're exaggerating it by saying your suitcase weighs a ton. Or if we said the boy was dying for new sneakers, you know, more than likely this boy doesn't have some sort of strange condition where his health is ailing because he isn't getting these sneakers he wants. It's very over the top, it's very exaggerated. We can imagine the boy wants these shoes so badly that we say that he's dying for these new sneakers. And lastly, kind of a joke of her grandma was older than the hills. So hills being sort of a geological structure, probably millions of years old. Grandmas don't live that long. We wish they did, but they don't typically. So using this exaggeration of saying her grandma was older than the hills is sort of this exaggerated joke that her grandma is quite old. And I just sort of have this picture over here of this dog with this #1 sort of award, meaning that like things that are the best, the most, the highest, the biggest, those types of examples can usually lead us to finding hyperbole. So where would be some examples of seeing these in real life? I guess I'll start with the second point just because the images are here and they're interesting. But advertising is a really common place where we see hyperbole because they want to sell their product, right? So they want us to think that it's the best, the fastest, the most whatever that it is. So if we look at this image in the upper right here, we've got a cob of corn, and we see that there's some Tabasco sauce in the background, which is like a hot, pepper sauce, or if you haven't had it, it's quite delicious. The image is indicating that the person must have put it on their corn, and it's so hot and it's so spicy that it actually made the corn turn into popcorn. And that's a pretty powerful image, right? It's funny, it's over the top, but it gives you that impression that, oh, it must be, that spicy. Obviously, it's not going to happen in real life. We're not supposed to take it literally, but it is a good form of advertising. On the flip side of that, we've got this Slurpee image here, where instead of it being something that's really hot, now we're looking at something that's really cold. So we're to assume that this person drank some of this Slurpee and it was so cold and so chilly that now like their hair has turned into icicles, or maybe they have brain freeze. The brain freeze part's probably likely, but the hair turning into icicles is probably a bit much. But again, it's kind of a good selling point to say, hey, on a hot day, if you want something really cold, something that's really going to be refreshing, come drink one of our 7-Eleven Slurpees. Actually, I think it says brain freeze right there. I just noticed that. And then a third example would be Altoids saying, mints so strong, they come in a metal box. Obviously, this isn't true. The mints wouldn't be any less potent if they came in a cardboard box or something like that, but it's a fun selling point for the product that sort of showcases just how strong and minty that they are. Folk tales and fairy tales are also great examples of hyperbole because you'll see a lot of things being exaggerated. So if we look at this passage here from Babe and the Blue Ox, which is like a Paul Bunyan story, if you've ever heard of that. It says, well now, one winter it was so cold that all the geese flew backward and all the fish moved south, and even the snow turned blue. Late at night, it got so frigid that all the spoken words froze solid afore they could be heard. People had to wait until sunup to find out what folks were talking about the night before. This is a lot of exaggeration, and it also makes for really great storytelling, right? We're supposed to believe that it was so cold that geese flew backward, which I've never seen before, but again, it's over the top to kind of get the point across. Some fish do migrate when it gets cold, but all the fish move south is very over the top statement. I've never seen snow being blue before, but I guess that helps me again to visualize that it's so insanely cold, the snow turned blue. And I really like this, this wording here where it says the words froze solid. So you can imagine that it was so chilly that people were having conversations and their words immediately froze, just like kind of how your breath freezes or shows a fog when it's cold outside. And they had to wait for the sun to come up in the morning to sort of melt the words, and all these sort of conversations popped up. It's just a fun image to think about. So again, over the top, hyperbole. Let's see what we have next. Oh, okay, understatement. This is the exact opposite of hyperbole, where hyperbole was over the top, understatement. So over, under, understatement is basically when we're going to present something as being smaller, less bad, less important, etc., than it really is. I feel like understatement goes hand in hand with being sarcastic. That's kind of like for a comedic effect. I think that works pretty well. So some examples of understatement include, there's some water in the Pacific Ocean. Definitely an understatement. The Pacific Ocean is ginormous. There is definitely way more than some water, but by saying there's some water in the Pacific Ocean, we're being a bit silly, we're being a bit facetious, we're using understatement to kind of bring some comedic effect. Let's say we have a scenario where a boy gets his test back, he has a perfect score, and then he says to his friend, yeah, I guess I passed. He's using sarcasm because he didn't just, barely pass, he got a perfect score. So he's using understatement in this scenario. And lastly, kind of what this picture here on the slide is describing is maybe this friend trips and spills like a whole coffee all down their shirt. And then their friend says to them, it's barely noticeable, your tie will cover that right up. Certainly not true. It's an entire coffee. This tie is definitely not going to cover up this mess. But the friend was kind of trying to be helpful and provide an understatement, maybe to cheer their friend up a little bit. So looking at some examples of understatement in real life, this image here sort of sums it up perfectly. When Apollo 13 ran into some trouble, their oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles away from Earth. Instead of like screaming and freaking out, Jim Lovell said on the ship, Houston, we've had a problem. So, again, that's quite an understatement given how far away from Earth they were at the time. But maybe his calm demeanor helped, was part of their success for getting home. And then an example we have over here to the side in literature is, this one comes from The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, where the main character Holden Caulfield says, I have to have this operation. It isn't very serious. I have this little tumor on the brain. So by nature, a tumor, especially a brain tumor, is pretty serious. So by this character sort of downplaying it, it does provide a little bit of like sarcasm and comedic effect. Okay, this one is our last type that we're going to go through for today, our literary devices, the oxymoron. So how will we know that we find it when we come across it? This is a figure of speech where we've got two essentially opposite terms that appear together, two contradictory terms. Often it will be the first term of the two words will be an adjective, and the second one will be a noun. It's not always the case, but it's kind of like a code that you can look for. So some examples of that would be bittersweet. Bitter and sweet by nature are two very different things, but I'm sure we've all been through experiences before that we could describe as bittersweet, something that's both good and bad, happy and sad. Maybe a great friend of yours got a new job and they're moving far away. That could be a bittersweet thing because you're happy for your friend. That's like the sweet thing, but the bitter part is that they're moving away and maybe you won't see them every day anymore. Another example would be deafening silence. So deafening typically means like a sound that's very, very loud. Silence is the opposite of that. But for example, maybe you had to like give a presentation in front of the class and you're done with your presentation and no one says anything. There's like crickets, right? That could be a deafening silence because you're afraid, no one's clapping, no one's saying anything good or bad. You're just sort of waiting for a reaction. So that silence can actually feel very loud and very scary. A small crowd is also a good one because crowd naturally means like a large group of people. So how can a large group of people be small? But in a way, it's like a good descriptor because, lets you know like, maybe this isn't like the Million Man March. This is more of like a 200 people standing around somewhere. So it gives you something to visualize. And lastly, an open secret. So secrets are typically something that are supposed to be hidden or just kept between a couple of people. An open secret is likely something that everyone knows but no one talks about. So that makes it an oxymoron. So some examples in literature and pop culture, Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet used the oxymoron sweet sorrow, where the line says, good night, parting is such sweet sorrow, that I shall say good night till it be morrow. So sweet sorrow is basically bittersweet. Saying goodbye is sad, but at least that means that I'll see you tomorrow, and that's the good thing, right? Movie titles are full of oxymorons. True Lies, Night of the Living Dead. How can something both be dead and alive? But typically that's what they'll call a zombie, a living dead, or the undead. Back to the Future. If something's in the future, how could you go back? But as time travelers, they certainly did it. Urban cowboy. So urban typically means like a city. Cowboys are usually found out in rural areas. So we've got this juxtaposition here. And also little big man. So little and big, quite opposite, but this is describing this person using an oxymoron. So now we're going to have a quiz. Let's go through some examples and see how we do. All right, name that literary device. We've got jumbo shrimp. What do we think? We look at it, we've got a two-word phrase that kind of might give us a clue. And we also see that they're quite opposite. So that's right, this is an oxymoron. Shrimp, again, by nature, typically means it's something that's small. Jumbo is large, but this is kind of like that small crowd scenario where shrimp typically are small, but at least if you have to put it on a scale, a jumbo shrimp is going to be a large shrimp. So again, we've got those two contradictory words. One is an adjective and one is a noun, and that kind of helps us to figure out that it is an oxymoron. Let's try the next one. The Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole on the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate. This is a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a little bit challenging, but if you look close, you can see a clue word right here, as. That's right, that makes this a simile because we have like or as. Basically, we're saying that this character, Dill, is sort of being drawn by this invisible force to this home that he is fascinated by. Just like how the moon is responsible for drawing the water of our oceans out and making the tide. So using this comparison of the moon and the tides and this character's fascination to this house to be a comparison using as we saw, and that makes it a simile. All right, next one. So this is going to be the poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Again, a little bit tricky, but if we look closely, we can see some examples of this person's horse having some human characteristics. We've got personification. So horses are certainly smart animals, but we've got this line here that says, my little horse must think it queer, meaning think it strange. Horses, again, intelligent, but are they really going to have complex thoughts about, hey, we're stopping, near this place where there isn't a farmhouse? That's kind of weird. Probably not. We're maybe giving the horse a little bit too much credit. And we also have this example here where it says, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. Certainly, horses are very capable of shaking their harness, and that might have bells on it and making noise. But to insinuate that the horse is shaking the bells to ask, hey, is there a problem here? Again, is maybe giving them a little bit too much credit. So again, it's personification because the horse is given these human traits, and more than likely, horses don't have these complex of thoughts and motivations. All right, this is one of my favorite examples. We've got a cartoon here. It looks like a little maybe dog person, a little hat on, drinking some coffee, but he's surrounded by flames and then is seemingly saying, this is fine. That's right, it's understatement. We're using this situation, this really terrible situation of this dog being completely engulfed in flames and saying like, this is fine, saying it's really not that bad for comedic effect. So this is definitely a great example of understatement. Okay, this one is a little bit tough. We've got an excerpt from the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, with this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Any ideas? So in this one, we're comparing two things where we're not using like or as, so we've got a metaphor. We are comparing jangling discords. Discords typically means like not bad sound, jangling. So like we have this idea of a not so great sound, but a symphony, is a bunch of instruments playing together in harmony. It's beautiful. So we're comparing jangling discords to symphony of brotherhood. And on a deeper level, at the time, MLK Jr. was basically saying, comparing, the time, what was happening at the time, the divisive racism in the country, the situation at hand, hopefully sort of turning into a symphony of brotherhood, a time of peace, of relative peace and harmony. So he's got metaphors on multiple levels here because he's a wonderful speaker, great speechwriter. So again, we're comparing jangling discords with beautiful symphony. We didn't use like or as, so that makes it a metaphor. All right, last one. So we've got a poster here from the Barnum and Bailey Circus. It is being touted as the greatest show on earth. What does that sound like? To me, it sounds like hyperbole. That's right. So we're basically over-exaggerating. There's no way of proving that this is the greatest circus or the greatest show on earth. But in order to sell more tickets, they're going to use some hyperbole. They're going to say that it's the best, the greatest, the most wonderful, etc. In order to get their point across. So that is all that I have on literary devices for today. Certainly there are, more terms, but this is just kind of an introduction. I hope that you enjoyed the lesson and have a great day.